In 1970, 116 convention delegates gathered at the old state capitol in Springfield to make history.
"1970 was a landmark event in Illinois history, and many people said for years it couldn't happen. Even after its approval, many people felt that but for an amazing alignment of the planets and the stars, it never should have happened. This month marks the 30th anniversary of the Constitutional Convention and the ratification of its work product. And we are celebrating that event today because it's an amazing story that spans decades of failure to modernize a Constitution adopted in 1870 that was born of the fear of the citizenry and indeed became a straitjacket that so impeded government that all kinds of artifices were designed to circumvent its prohibitions. Even the Illinois Supreme Court participated by approving special agencies to issue bonds the state could not, and by approving an income tax that most legal scholars felt was fatally infirm under the 1870 Constitution. The duties and responsibilities of government at all levels changed dramatically following World War II. Voter expectations of government's role changed, and yet the hands of elected officials were essentially tied. Indeed, under Dillon's rule that local governments had no power except those expressly granted by the state, the city of Chicago and other municipalities had to travel to Springfield for approval of even the most routine new programs. In the late 1940s, Sam Witwer and Walter Schaefer traveled to Springfield to convince the General Assembly to call a constitutional convention, and their plea was dismissed almost out of hand. Governor Stevenson tried 2 years later and lost narrowly in the House of Representatives. But that same year, the House of Representatives, the General Assembly, adopted the Gateway Amendment to make passage of constitutional amendments easier. However, the subsequent failure of constitutional reform efforts proved that Gateway was not the answer either. Marjorie Pebworth was elected to the Illinois House in the 1964 bedsheet-size ballot at-large election, and she sponsored the creation of a Constitutional Study Commission. In 1967, the commission recommended the call for a constitutional convention to be placed on the ballot. The General Assembly passed the proposal. However, since the proposal required approval of a majority of those voting in the presidential general election, few pundits gave it much chance of success. However, the blue ballot campaigns over the previous 20 years had at least sensitized voters to the issue. Moreover, Kingman Douglas and Bill Kufus, the co-chairs of the campaign for the call, put together a marvelous coalition of civic leaders and organizations and politicians. In addition, Governor Ogilvie and Mayor Richard J. Daley, as well as media throughout the state, supported the call. As a result, the call was approved by a substantial margin. The General Assembly had given very careful consideration to avoiding the failures of the past. It limited the pay and per diem for delegates to 8 months to avoid the Marathon Convention of 1920, which alienated the voters. You might think of that for the General Assembly, Governor. It adopted a proposed set of rules for the convention to govern itself. It commissioned academics to write background papers, and under the guidance of Professor Sam Gove and George Braden and Reuben Cohn, co-authored a definitive work on the old Constitution, judicial construction, problems, and alternatives. In retrospect, the General Assembly did much to assure that the convention could get off to a quick start and avoid as much as possible protracted delays arising from debate of housekeeping matters. As you can see from your program, the nonpartisan election of delegates mandated by the General Assembly had the salutary effect of attracting a unique and fresh set of faces to Springfield. They don't look quite as fresh today, but they were fresh then. The great majority had little, if any, political experience or had ever worked in a legislative setting before, but they were committed, they were bright, and they learned fast. Needless to say, there was some silliness, like the 45-minute debate that took place over whether a particular sentence should or should not include a third comma. There were also some parliamentary shenanigans. My personal favorite involved the member of a committee whose late arrival allowed the group to just meet its quorum. Other members of his particular interest group were absent, so when a vote came up that he was afraid of losing, he demanded a quorum call, then refused to answer when the secretary read his name. The chairman responded by saying that since apparently there was no one present asking for a quorum, the committee was free to move ahead with the vote. The man protested, "But I'm asking for a quorum." The chairman answered, "But you're not here," and proceeded with the business at hand. Still, in spite of themselves, their leadership, and outside forces, convention delegates avoided disaster and created a new constitution which, by any measure, was a great improvement over 1870. Had delegates been more doctrinaire, or if the major political parties had controlled the convention, or if Governor Ogilvie or Mayor Richard J. Daley had been heavier-handed, or if the media had been less even-handed about the doings of the convention, the process would have been doomed. But, as my mother often said to me when I escaped some peril to which I otherwise should have fallen prey, God takes care of the blind, the lame, and the halt. That phrase, by the way, had reference to her perception of my IQ was abnormally low. Granted, people of noble hearts spent decades awakening the electorate to our constitutional problems. And granted, the General Assembly gave very careful consideration to the necessary ingredients for a successful convention. And granted, the two major political leaders of the time, Governor Ogilvie and Mayor Richard J. Daley, were on the same page, supporting first the call for the convention and finally the ratification of its work product. Granted, the delegates were high-minded and unencumbered for the most part by partisan scars. And granted, Kingman Douglas and Bill Kufus were able to mobilize the business community, civic and trade organizations, and the media statewide. But even with these extraordinary windfalls, this achievement defied all odds. Even if one does not subscribe to a higher being, everyone would have to admit at a minimum that all of the planets and stars were properly aligned over Illinois in 1968, 69, and 70. From my perspective, the odds are better of winning the lottery. I think we had some extra help, whatever the source. Many people are owed much for their contribution to this effort to create a new constitution. Illinois and its governmental units have been able to design innovative solutions to problems that may otherwise have gone unaddressed. On at least two occasions, redistricting would have been roadblocked had it not been for the tiebreaker mechanism established under the new Constitution. The RTA never would have come into being. I wouldn't have a job today. Local governments without the new Constitution's home rule provisions would still be trudging down to Springfield for approval to change the color of the Mars lights on their squad cars. This is not the first time Illinois has responded to such a challenge. In spite of it being such a diverse state, racially, geographically, and economically, evenly split politically, Illinois has many times found statesmen who engaged in political compromise to achieve great things. Such a situation existed in 1967 through 1970. We see it again today in the efforts by Governor George H. Ryan and Mayor Richard M. Daley to compromise for the benefit of Illinois. In a very real way, some of their innovative solutions, not to mention the state's breakthrough infrastructure improvement programs, were made possible by the 1970 Constitution. This document works, except, of course, for the Des Plaines River ferrymen who, under one of the weirder provisions of the old Constitution, were excluded from having to serve jury duty. But for the rest of us, it works, and today we celebrate its creation. We are very fortunate that John Callaway agreed to serve as our moderator of a panel that embodies a unique collection of experience and experiences about the Constitution, the need for it, the political dynamic, and the subsequent successes it allowed. The panelists today are Michael Madigan, Speaker of the House of Representatives for 15 of the last 17 years. Be a habit, I guess, Mike. Mike was one of the youngest delegates to the convention. John McCarter, epitomized the cadre of bright young managers Dick Ogilvy brought to Springfield when he was elected governor. John served the Ogilvy administration as head of the Bureau of the Budget and Department of Finance. Ed Nash was the Springfield correspondent for the Waukegan News-Sun. He covered the Constitutional Convention and the General Assembly, and many people said no one knew more about state government than Ed Nash. And at this point, I want to make a correction to your program. Bill Harris could not be with us today. He's fine, by the way. But we are especially fortunate to have as a replacement Jeremiah Marsh, who was special counsel to Governor Ogilvy and served as the governor's chief liaison with the Constitutional Convention. He is chairman of Hopkins and Sutter and has a distinguished and enviable record in the Illinois legal community. Paula Wolf was a junior staffer in the Ogilvy administration and was assigned to monitor the convention. She subsequently was director of policy and planning for Governor James Thompson and directed Governor Edgar's transition team before becoming the president of Governor State University. She now works with Metropolis 2020. Cliff Kelly, a delegate committee chair on the Illinois Task Force on Constitutional Implementation and a member of the Illinois Local Government Advisory Council. Today, he hosts a popular radio talk show on radio stations WVON and WVAZ-FM. I'm sure that you will find their insights unique and educational. However, before we go to this lively discussion from our panelists, we have the distinct pleasure to hear from Governor George H. Ryan. Upon his election, Governor Ryan immediately restored civility to the political arena. He showed great political vision by proposing Illinois First, which will do so much for transportation, education, and human services. He has received national recognition for the courage he displayed in deciding to place a moratorium on executions until he can be assured that the defects in our criminal justice system can and have been resolved. Most of all, George Ryan embodies the concept that Illinois is one state and that Chicago is integral to the state's economy. No one has done more to see that this great city's needs are addressed by the state of Illinois than Governor George H. Ryan.
Thank you very much. Jeff, thank you. That was very nice and educational beside. And I'm delighted to be here as I look over this crowd. Some of you I recognize. Some of you ages and time has been very kind to. Then there's the rest of us that are involved. But I am glad to have the opportunity to be here. I want to say hello to my friend Speaker Madigan and to the members of the General Assembly that are here. The ones that I know are Representative Halverson's here, the Senator Dillard is here, and of course former Senator Dawn Clark Netsch is here. So I don't know if there are any other members of the General Assembly that I've missed, but when you got a budget session coming up and a new session coming in, you always want to recognize the members of the General Assembly. But I am delighted to have the opportunity to come here. I never had a chance to serve in the Constitutional Convention. I was never a candidate, frankly, but helped elect a fellow from Kankakee by the name of Don Ziglis, who just passed away about 3 weeks ago. Don was an avid member of the Constitutional Convention and worked hard. So celebrating the 30th anniversary of this Constitutional Convention in 1970 is, I'm sure, good for you folks that want to be here to reminisce about what you've done. I do know that I took state office as a member of the General Assembly in 1973, so the new Constitution was only 3 years old when I became a member of the House. But I know that the delegates worked hard and spent a lot of time. They were serious in their debate, and they came up with a great document that we now live with, and it's a good piece of work. Back in the 1960s, the state government was shackled with a 19th century constitution as what's his name pointed out here. What it really did was meet the needs of a growing and prosperous state. We had limited powers of the executive branch, as it was pointed out by Jeffrey, and while appointed boards and commissions were really unaccountable to the people or to the government. We had a legislature that had to approve budgets every 2 years. in advance. Now, that may not have been too bad, and maybe as Speaker Madigan and I look back, maybe wasn't a bad system then. But it was a system that couldn't meet the changes and the demands for changes that were needed for our state at that time. It was a governmental system, frankly, that was not able to respond to the needs of the people. And it didn't really work as it should because it was such an old system and antiquated rules and laws. But thankfully, there were some that were concerned, citizens who took upon themselves to make sure that the system was changed and that we did have a document that we could live with and work with. And it had been tried before, as Jeff pointed out, but no one could agree on how to replace the Constitution of 1870. It was a Union League club member, as was pointed out again by Jeff, who proved to be the most thoughtful on the problem created by the old Constitution and also a strategy to fix the situation. Under a committee formed by the Union League Club, the Special Committee on the Constitutional Convention, Attorney Robert Bergstrom, published a study that changed the course of the debate, calling for a new Constitution. At bipartisan rallies, Republicans and Democrats stood and talked about the new Constitution with Bergstrom's papers in hand, and they promoted a call for a new Constitution and a new Constitutional Convention. Bergstrom had the same strong commitment as another successful reformer, the late Samuel Whitwer, who enacted the Gateway Amendment that changed the way amendments were adopted under the old Constitution. And once a new Constitutional Convention was approved by the voters, Sam Whitwer then served nobly and ably as the convention president. In 1970, 116 convention delegates gathered at the old state capitol in Springfield to make history. And I asked Jeff when I came in here today, how many of you were left? And I think he said 56 were still remaining 30 years later. But they were people that were teachers and bankers and attorneys and business people and farmers. They represented all of the people of the state, as it should have been. And Chicago's own mayor, Richard J. Daley, was a delegate, as many of you in this room. I think you told me there's 28 members here today that were in the convention. So as a governor who was sworn to uphold that Constitution every day, I want to thank those of you that are here and those that aren't for your efforts with the delegates recognized that the power of the governor needed to be expanded. The executive changes included allowing the governor and the lieutenant governor to run as a team. Now, there was a reason for that, and it was a political reason, and you all know what that was. If you had a different party, we did have that, and there were problems with it. Eliminating the possibility, frankly, of having a governor and a lieutenant governor from separate parties. The governor also remained as governor if he left the state. Previously, under the old Constitution, the lieutenant governor automatically became the governor if the governor left the state. And I believe back in Dick Ogilvy's days, we had a Democrat lieutenant governor and a Republican governor. And as a result, Dick Ogilvy was always about half afraid to leave the state. And when he did, he was okay. But the new Constitution also authorized agency reorganization by executive power, and that gave us more to work with. It allowed governors to reassign functions or to reassign and reorganize agencies that were directly responsible to the governor. This allowed some greater control and certainly some continuity of services for the citizens most in need of our attention. In addition, the governor's total veto power. He was given the opportunity of having a line item veto, an item reduction power, and an amendatory veto, which are very important. Now, I've only had a couple of opportunities as governor. We've had 2 legislative sessions and had an opportunity to use some of this power that's been given to me. And it's a good function to have to do the kind of job. It gives you the flexibility that you need. The governor is also given the power to call the General Assembly or the Senate alone into special session. And we recently saw the benefits of that power through the reenactment of the Safe Neighborhoods Act and the ability to suspend the state's gasoline taxes. So these were and are great powers for the chief executive of the state. And as most of you as delegates know, I think that you had extraordinary foresight when you put these powers in, because they are very effective. Your legacy certainly continues to serve the people of Illinois well as we begin a new century. And I have no doubt that the next 100 years, your legacy will continue to serve the people of Illinois well. So I want to thank all of you for allowing me to come and share your memories of 30 years ago and the times that you've been through. And thank the members of the Union League Club for their support for organizing this tribute today. And certainly want to thank my friend Jeff Ladd for including me. I think it's always important to discuss how we can make this state a better place for the people of Illinois. And I think this document that you've provided has made the state a better place to live and will continue to do that. So again, thank you. I look forward to the discussion, and it's nice to be with all of you. Thanks very much. I look forward to the discussion, and we're going to do the papers somewhere.
Thank you, Governor. In 1968, I had the distinct pleasure of being elected delegate to the Constitutional Convention. It changed my life profoundly. Because of it, I went to law school. Because of it, I gained a new respect for government and that political process. I also had the chance to meet each of the panel members. Serving as a delegate was an extraordinary experience, and now you're in for a real treat as you hear firsthand about how that experience came to be, what it consisted of, and the implications of it for Illinois voters. And now it's my great pleasure to turn the program over to John Callaway and his distinguished panel, who we're going to ask to join us here on the stage. Thank you. Go get him, John.
Come on up, panelists. While you're coming up, let me ask, aside from anybody on the panel, and there are some on the panel, for all of you who were members of the original CONCON to stand so that we can give you a round of applause. They will be available in the back of the hall after this session for comments on nutrition and exercise that maintained them over the years. Every once in a while, I'm asked to moderate a panel, and the panel is preceded by a speaker or by speakers who answer every single question that I, the moderator, had planned for the panel. Jeffrey, you did that today, and so thank you all very much. Let's get out of here. Just a personal confession. I started covering government and other things in Chicago in 1956 as a young reporter for the City News Bureau, and then over to CBS by March of '57. And so frequently, I'll say in a press blurb or something that I've been covering this town for 44 years. But the fact of the matter is, after we started WBBM News Radio in '68, we were apparently so successful that they kicked me upstairs to New York to help develop the all-new stations across the country for CBS, and I missed this convention. I did a lot of work over the years. I knew Sam Witwer. I'd done many interviews with Sam and others leading up to this process. And of course, I've done a huge amount of work after the process. But I wasn't here in Illinois for this convention. So I didn't tell Jeff this when he invited me to be the moderator. I'm looking at this today for me as an educational experience, because I'm really curious about some things that I didn't get to cover firsthand. So I thank you for the opportunity to moderate this conference. It's what moderating a panel is what I'm looking to do in my retirement on Friday afternoons, and I'm grateful for the chance to do that. Now, all of our panelists have been introduced, but I want to ask them, and Ed, I'll start with you. Just give us a paragraph or a story or something kind of on where you were with your career or how you came to this. Was this kind of central to your life or was it a periphery sort of thing? Let's just kind of get a, who were you then? What were you doing? What was the feel of your life at that time? And how important was this to you at that time? And then we'll get into the issues.
Well, to start with the last first, very important to me, personally and career-wise, a real privilege and pleasure to have been a part of the convention, and I think the press corps was indeed part of the convention. I was there, and I think I represented the smallest daily newspaper in Illinois on a regular basis at the Constitutional Convention. And I was the political editor for the Waukegan News-Sun, tucked way up in the northeastern corner of the state, and had been covering politics and the courthouse. And of course, you cover a courthouse in Illinois, and you cover politics automatically because they really are one and the same. They're certainly intertwined. And also had gone to national conventions and that sort of thing. And it was very fortunate that F. Ward Just, the publisher of the paper, decided that he wanted to have personal coverage of the Constitutional Convention. And out of our circulation area in Lake and McHenry counties, 4 delegates out of the 116 that was mentioned earlier, 116, were our people. And so that is what my major job was, to keep track of what they were thinking, what they were proposing, what they were up to. But it was a real experience, and it's obviously a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and I wouldn't have missed it for anything.
Thank you. Paula, what were you up to at that time?
Well, I had just turned 24 years old. I was at the University of Chicago and was studying political theory. I had done my prelims and my coursework to write my dissertation. I was predisposed not to write my dissertation at the moment, and I got a call from George Ranney, and he and John McCarter were running the Bureau of the Budget, and they asked me if I would come and be a budget analyst in the Bureau of the Budget. And since I knew absolutely nothing about state government, it seemed like a good idea. So I came, and they figured out very early I was not a good budget analyst because I wanted to give away too much money, right, John? So I was dispatched to cover the Constitutional Convention, and I worked with George and John and Jerry Marsh. Well, I'm sure Jerry will explain whatever the strategy was. I couldn't figure it out at the time, but as somebody who had studied political theory, this was, as Jeff referenced in his remarks, quite an eye-opening experience. It really wasn't what I had been reading about. It didn't have a lot to do with Plato and Aristotle. Was it important to me? Yes. I would say in 3 very significant ways. The first, I went back after I finished working on the Constitutional Convention, went to see my dissertation advisor, and he said, "What have you been doing for the last 2.5 years?" And I told him, and he said, "What are you doing here today?" And I said, "Well, I've come back because I'm going to write my dissertation now." And he said, "Well, what are you going to write on?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to write on the derivation of the First Amendment from ecclesiastical law in England." And he said, "I don't think so." He said, "Why don't you write about the Constitutional Convention, and then you can write about ecclesiastical law and the First Amendment for the rest of your life." So I did write about the Constitution, so that was the basis for my PhD thesis. The second reason it was important to me is I did end up in state government working. In fact, I'm a barnacle in state government, worked for 30 years in state government, and this really was the introduction to me. And third, and as we used to say at the convention, I didn't, I just watched, all of you said, as a point of personal privilege, I would say that I met my husband. We eloped on Earth Day of 1970 and have been married for 30 years, have 4 children, one of whom is lurking someplace in the audience, I believe. So it's very important for me.
Sounds like a pretty good TV show. I'll get back to you later on that. Cliff, I met you, I think, when I came back in 72.
Right.
I met you, and you were in the city council. Well, what were you up to back, say, in 68, 69?
That's right, John. Not as exciting as Paula. What happened, and Jeff Ladd could be in the media because he gave some erroneous information. I did not. I did not come from Ralph Metcalf's organization. My political mentor was Kenneth Campbell, and I was attacking some of the things that were going on in my area, and he, of course, was a member of the regular Democratic organization, and they know how to preempt people who they fear or they don't like or whatever, or disagree with them, they bring them in. I had just finished law school, and I got a job, John, with the real Secretary of State, Paul Powell.
Oh, yeah. There's another TV show.
Yeah, that's right. I was a hearing officer, hearing cases on the Uniform Commercial Code and that sort of thing. And at that point, the Constitutional Convention came up, and unlike many of his colleagues, Alderman Campbell did try to bring in young people. In fact, I had gotten involved based on his desires in the Young Democrats and so forth, and he said this is a good opportunity for someone who is young to get involved, and he selected me to run, and it has been one of the best experiences, not only for all the things that Jeff Ladd and the governor said, but meeting some of these people who I'm so happy to see here today, and the work that they did was something else. There's one other thing, only one other thing that Jeff said I disagree with, and I'll talk about that a little later. I had 4 different responsibilities. I was a member of the Legislative Committee. I also was my procedural committee was public information, John. And then, as was mentioned, I was appointed by the governor to the Commission on Constitutional Implementation. But also well, let me just say this. The situation with public information, the press really bothered me. He said that the press was even-handed. I remember, and you would appreciate this, watching Lynn O'Connor, and I'm sure some of you remember this. We had to move from the state building where we were meeting to the old state capitol because the legislature had to come in on a special session based on a problem with the CTA. So there was a special session relative to the funding of the Chicago Transit Authority. Lynn O'Connor did this and said this commentary and said that we were going to steal the artifacts out of the old state capitol. And why would we be there anyway? Because whatever we come up with, the people are not going to vote for it. And I think some of you might remember, Tom Lyons, we passed a resolution condemning that, and that was the sort of thing that really bothered me, because I saw these people really working. And as the governor mentioned, the Enabling Act called for 8 months of pay. Well, we worked longer than 8 months, and there wasn't one person who said, we want to get out of here. They worked another month, and I mean worked long hours. So for him to say that, and that's just one of many, but that bothered me. But it was a great event.
Well, Lynn O'Connor, of course, has passed away and isn't here to defend himself, but I know that he would be proud to know that he was being attacked even all these many years after his death. That's what commentators are there for.
Right.
I'm going to do one for Carol Marine tonight, and I hope you attack me 20, 30 years from now after that. Speaker Madigan, what were you up to 30 years ago in the
First,
state
I
of
have
Illinois?
I have no complaints about the media. Can we make that a matter of record?
Thank you, thank you,
I love the media.
thank you. We love you too, Jim. Mike.
In 1969, I was a young lawyer with a strong interest in politics, government, elective office. Like Cliff, this was an opportunity that came along. I went to see my ward committeeman, who told me that he would support me, but then another ward committeeman in the district told me that he had gotten a call from my ward committeeman saying that my ward committeeman was against me. But I got slated anyhow, and the great advantage for me was the opportunity to learn so much about the governmental issues that I have now worked with over 30 years. And I've said this in the legislature, which is that all of the issues and the matters that come before the legislature day in and day out can find a root in the Constitution. And in one way or another, were considered during the deliberations of the Constitutional Convention.
John, what were you up to 30 years ago?
I was just back from Lyndon Johnson's Budget Bureau in Washington, trying to become reacquainted with Illinois. And to me, the intertwining of the Ogilvy administration and what we were working on and the agenda of CONCON really has struck me as to how close what we all were trying to do at the time that we were to one another. I still remember at the Union League Club, the first public announcement of Richard Ogilvy's staff and cabinet was at the celebratory
dinner that Kingman Douglas chaired in that December of 1968. So it was our coming of age as an administration, and then the Concon's appearance. So it was all very much, to my way of thinking, one piece of cloth that we were all working together on.
Okay, Jerry?
I was Governor Ogilvy's special counsel and chief troubleshooter in 1969 and 70. One of the responsibilities that went with that was to be his coordinator of legislative and policy development matters, and as the CONCON unfolded, that sort of gravitated into that sphere. So I was his coordinator of our relationship with the convention, although strangely, it was very much in the background. We, as a matter of policy, early on decided not to try to aggressively lobby the convention, and because we didn't think that would be very effective due to the independence of the members. We had some evidence that we were correct in that, and we acted on that premise all the way through, and it turned out to have been very wise. And that helps explain Paula. She was a 24-year-old U of C graduate student, and she was the monitor of our relationships with the convention, and was extremely effective. But because of her style and her brilliance, was not resented, and it helped greatly with the impact that Ogilvy had on the ultimate result.
Well, thank you all very much for that. I think it gives us kind of a human side of you as we go into this public policy discussion. And let me ask you to help me as we proceed this afternoon with the following problem. I've got some questions. I think most of them are fairly obvious, but I may not know which person to direct them to. So if I do direct them to you, I'm going to, in fact, Ed, I'm going to start with you on it. But if you think there's somebody, you know enough about this to know that, that John McCarter could probably help to start off with better, just throw the ball down to him, and then the other thing I'd ask the panel is, instead of having a response from every single one of you to every question, why don't you just kind of raise a hand and chime in, because some of you, I think, will want to get in on some of it more than other parts of the discussion. But Ed, let me tell you that Jeff Ladd gave me about a dozen books and monographs to read in preparing for this thing. And I'm a little bit confused because I read kind of two different streams. One was that there was a tremendous history of work towards this convention, as it were, or that which propelled this convention, that went over decades. And at the same time, I think I got the sense that there was no great public outcry, that if a reporter had gone out to Berwyn and talked to people, they wouldn't have said, well, you know what we need? It's a constitutional convention, by God. That there was no great man in the street demand for this thing. And I wonder if you could, are those things true, and to what extent, give us a little of the setting for this convention, politically.
Well, for one thing, as I recall, the people of Illinois voted about a 3-to-1 ratio to have the Constitutional Convention in the first place. And that was kind of surprising, I think, to a lot of people.
What accounted for that, if indeed it's true that there wasn't some huge passion in the street? Was this simply where leadership paid off?
I think that's probably true to a certain extent. And after all, we hadn't had a constitutional convention in a half a century, and that one had a very sad history. They met for 2 years and 9 months, and it was clobbered 5-to-1 by the electorate. So the last one we had that was successful was the Constitutional Convention that produced the 1870 Constitution.
But let me put the question this way. Were there, when they did vote for this thing 3-to-1, did the leaders who presented it, were they able to say, look, average citizen, here are some benefits for you. Here's some pain you've been suffering because of this outdated Constitution, and here's how it can be remedied? Or was it just one of these things where, yeah, the newspapers say we ought to do it, and the governor says we ought to do it, so we'll do it?
I really don't know whether I'm qualified to talk about that, but I think that it was an increasing feeling that something had to be done. And Jeff Ladd touched upon that in his remarks at the beginning, that it was just getting people realizing that you had an old Constitution, you couldn't change it very easily, and that something had to be done, and we haven't had a constitutional convention in a century, let's give it a try. I think that was the prevailing philosophy to a large extent.
Jerry, what was your read of that?
I think that the rank and file voters were not burning up to have a constitutional convention, and I don't recall, except in certain interest groups, that people were out there saying, here's what you'll get out of it. But it was a long-standing God and motherhood premise that it had been a long time. The 1870 Constitution had a lot wrong with it, and there needed to be a fresh look taken, and everybody was saying that was probably true, and I think that all contributed to it.
Cliff, at that time, we're talking about a major, the 60s were a period of tremendous turmoil. And there was, inside the African American community, tremendous turmoil, breaking away from the Dawson Organization, et cetera,
Right.
the assassination of King, the '68 convention, all of that turmoil going on, the Vietnam War, et cetera. Did any of that have, as you remember, play into this time of seminal change?
I think in the community that I represented, John, that's a possibility. Things were bad, as you just alluded to, and I think people were certainly looking for change. There are a lot of folks who were, I think, knowledgeable of the need for a new Constitution. I would suggest that they are in the minority. They were in the minority. But then when the leadership of the political organizations and some civic organizations, obviously, there were a lot of people who got together and finally said this is something that's needed. And yes, I do think it was very easy in our community to push it, to say that we do need a new Constitution. And we had seminars. I remember speaking in a number of colleges, community colleges in the area, and also the different organizations. And I think, yes, people had a lot to complain about, as you point out, and they were always willing to listen to something that they perceived could be a resolution to some of the problems.
Speaker Madigan, when Jeff Ladd made his introductory remarks, he told us that the stars were aligned in the right place politically, that Mayor Richard J. Daley was for this, that the Republican Governor Ogilvie was for this, and yet he said at the conclusion of his remarks that he views it as a miracle that it really came to be and that it got the work done that it did. Now, if you've got Richard J. Daley and Richard Ogilvie for something, and your Constitution's 100 years out of date, and it's a time of political change, what the hell is the big deal? Why don't we go play some golf? What's the conversation? What was miraculous about it? Sounds like an easy call.
Well, I think that, the tenor of the times was not in favor of the constitutional change, and I would refer you to some of the separate vote questions that were taken on December 15th of 1970. So as an example, on a separate question to abolish the death penalty, the state voted 2-1 to keep the death penalty, and on a separate question to lower the voting age to age 18, that also was soundly defeated. And so when the people voted, they voted to have 21 as the voting age. Now, it was subsequently brought down to 18 because of action of the courts. I think Jeff is correct. Many things came together. I firmly believe that the single most important reason for the adoption of the Constitution was the support of Mayor Daley. And he supported the Constitution because of the inclusion of home rule
He had a lot riding on that, didn't he?
in the document. And I had a personal conversation with him just a few days before the ratification vote, and all the earlier conversations with the mayor had been negative on different aspects of the Constitution. But in the end, his statement to me was that home rule was just too attractive to the administration of the city of Chicago to not support the adoption of the new Constitution. And I was just doing some real quick math, and on the question of adopting the Constitution, there was a difference of less than 300,000 people statewide. First, let me say this. A little over 2 million people voted on the day that the Constitution was ratified. A little over 2 million people applied for ballot on December 15, 1970, on the question, shall the new Constitution be adopted? Let's assume that the population of the state was about 10 million.
Right.
So that was about a 20% turnout. Now, in a 20% turnout election in 1970 with Mayor Daley's organization very active in the election, the difference in the vote was less than 300,000. And so you can ask yourself, was Mayor Daley's organization on December 15, 1970 worth 300,000 votes? And if it wasn't worth 300,000, it was pretty close
Right,
to
yeah, you
300,000. And he supported the adoption of the new Constitution. And so I would say there's plenty of credit to go around. Sam Whitwer did a great job in working us through the convention and identifying pitfalls in terms of the eventual adoption of the Constitution. He was the one who suggested that there be separate questions so that a question like the death penalty or the voting age would not bring down the entire document. He did a great job.
That was critical, wasn't it?
Correct. Bringing all different factors together. But then there was an election day, and Mayor Daley supported the Constitution.
But Jerry, Cliff,
having Ogilvy and Daley unified in favor of the Constitution.
well, the Speaker has just
And-
given us kind of the
a
daily
great
route.
deal went in-
What about Ogilvy? What were his reservations? Because
His
he clearly
reservation?
wanted executive power, if Jeff is right. He wanted executive power that didn't obtain at the time. But did he worry about some of these other things,
Yes,
like the death penalty or?
yes. For example, he was a personal proponent of home rule, which was a very important factor here. He was willing and understood the needs of local government for revenue, and that included willingness to live with real estate property tax classification in Cook County, because it was an absolute necessity. Reformers, many of them, would have gone to the point of trying to eliminate that, and they would have lost the compromise in the end. Ogilvy had a great deal to gain in the executive article. Governor Ryan summarized it very concisely here half an hour ago,
But did
and he understood that.
Did Governor Ogilvy also have support from mayors and the heads of municipalities who were supporters of his, perhaps smaller institutions? Did home rule apply to them in ways that were meaningful also? Was it something other than just say, yeah, Mayor Daley, I'll help you?
Oh, yeah, it could apply. I've forgotten the precise criteria, but I believe it's in units of 25,000 or more. If they elect home rule by a vote, then they've got the power at the municipal governing board level to enact ordinances time after time after time. Whereas under the old rules, you had to take those things back to Springfield with very explicit statutes, and they all became trading bait. If you were, there were people, I'm sure, that advised the governor that he shouldn't go for this because he lost leverage in a sense. But he didn't see it that way. He really believed in the people's ability to govern at the most immediate level, and he supported home rule for that reason.
Cliff, you want to get back?
Yeah, I
in?
just wanted to mention, I think Speaker Madigan said something that really made the difference, John, by having these four separate issues: the death penalty, the 18-year-old vote, single-member districts versus cumulative voting, and merit selection versus the election of judges. I think if that had not been the case, and I was against that at the time, I said, listen, we've been working here for 9 months, let's vote it up or down and put it out there. In retrospect, I'm glad that didn't happen, because I think if it had, there would have been too many people who said, no, we can't go along with this, and it would have gone down to two. So that was extremely wise.
Give us, if you would, a paragraph or two on the whole question of fairness and how the convention itself got the delegates elected, and how, what was the politics of that by and large? Was that an interesting or A vital story we should know something about?
Well, the politics was that there wasn't partisan politics as far as the election of the delegates were concerned. They were elected on a nonpartisan basis, but it wasn't very long after the convention convened that you knew exactly who the Republicans were, who the Democrats were, and who the independents were. And that's okay, that's fine. That's the way our legislature had operated all along, and it seemed to work out pretty well, particularly in a state that's divided as closely between Republicans and Democrats as
So
this
did the
one.
convention end up being reasonably representative of the state?
I would
Or
think
or
that's
perhaps
good.
terrifically representative
I
of
would
the
think
state?
so. They were elected from what were then state senate districts, 2 from each one, and I think that's a fair analysis, yes.
Speaker?
John, my recollection is that we would estimate that maybe 1/3 of the convention were Democrats, 1/3 Republicans, and the other third not aligned. And on critical issues, the non-aligned third would go back and forth on different issues. And so I'm looking out at Tom Lyons. I know we would have private conversations where it would be our opinion that the unaligned people were the ones who were making the decisions in the convention.
I would make one quick point on representation, which was that the Constitutional Convention was unusually representative in terms of women, which was totally different from the legislature at that point. So in some ways, it was a precursor for what happened later in terms of women's rights. I mean, a lot of the things in the Bill of Rights actually were issues that we're still fighting about that are more progressive in ours. But I would say in that sense, it was very representative and unlike the rest of the political system.
It was ahead of the
the curve in terms of the
Speaker
politics.
Madigan, didn't you do a little research on this for us?
There were 13 women out of 116. Paula was happy.
Well, no, but I mean, that was big time in those days.
Absolutely.
And then you had how many minority?
13 blacks.
15 blacks, according
50?
to this.
Yeah, isn't
13.
Cliff, wouldn't that be
13.
viewed as almost radically
There
progressive?
were
compared
13
to-
blacks, and let me say this. My experience there, John, made it very difficult for me to understand why the city council couldn't do the same thing that the African Americans in the Constitutional Convention did. We met, the 12 of us were from Chicago, the 13th was Butch Fenoy from St. Clair County. He would even come up. We had meetings prior to the convention convening, and then when we got there, we found out that there were, the black newspapers in Chicago weren't covering us, so we hired out of our own money a gentleman named Simeon Osby, who was a great publicist in Springfield, and he would cover the convention and the things that he felt were necessary that the African-American community ought to know about, he would send them to the newspapers throughout the state.
Were the special interests, today we say, well, the special interests control the society and et cetera, et cetera. If only the people could speak. How were the special interests? How did they behave during this time, the big ones?
I would say no different than is true with the legislative sessions. And with 116 delegates, you had 116 special interests, and that's just the way things are. In this
No, but
country.
I'm saying aside from them, did you have disproportionate power, or attempt at disproportionate power utilized by special interests that have disproportionate money?
I don't recall specific instances.
Anybody
of
else? Speaker?
John, the Chamber of,
Currency
banking.
exchanges, banking, okay.
Banking.
that's-
Branch banking.
Banking.
Branch banking?
And they ended up getting a
the
provision in the
usual special
Constitution.
interests were around the convention. As an example, the Chamber of Commerce successfully got a provision in the Constitution which restricts the income tax so that you cannot have an increase in the corporate income tax without a commensurate increase in the personal income tax. That was something that they had gotten into the legislation that provided for the adoption of the income tax over in the legislature in 1969. They came over to the convention. They made sure that it went in to the document. The bank debate occurred at the convention, the large banks against the small banks, and there was a section put into the document which provided that you needed an extraordinary vote in the legislature for branch banking. So the special interests were there. They were working hard. Again, credit goes to Sam Whitwer, because his goal was to adopt a new constitution. In order to do that, you needed a successful referendum vote. And he argued that throughout the convention, that our goal was to get a new document and that we had to be very careful in terms of what went into the proposal, because certain items could take down the proposal on the referendum election day.
Well, let's,
John,
yes, Cliff.
we had, in the legislative committee, we had testimony from a special interest, but from another delegate, who also was a state representative, and a wonderful gentleman who is an Italian historian, a lawyer who was a trial attorney in the Nuremberg trials. And we're speaking of Victor Arrigo. I'm sure you all remember him. He's no longer with us, but Victor was such a great gentleman. He had this centurion voice, John, and he came in, and he was upset because the old Constitution had the Columbian Exposition in it, and that wasn't going to be there anymore. So he wanted something in there, and so he suggested to us that we should put in the 500th anniversary of the discovery of America by Columbus.
In the Constitution.
Right, right. As we tried to tell him, the Columbian Exposition shouldn't be there, and of course we weren't going to do this. But I did ask him, I said, well, you can probably tell us the answer to this question, which has bothered me for years. I understand there were really 5 ships in Columbus's entourage, but the other 2 fell over the edge.
One of the, if I recall correctly, one of the delegates to the convention was a man that I later got to know. Well, actually, I knew him at that time. I knew him before then. He's no longer with us. But he may have been the only delegate who was criticized publicly by the Chicago Tribune. And his name was Elmer Gertz. And Elmer raises, the name Elmer Gertz raises a category of consideration by the convention of human rights. And of course, Elmer was very strongly against the death penalty, and I think there were other human rights issues that he wished to be addressed. How did he end up faring, he and his colleagues who favored that agenda?
Go ahead, Paul.
I was just going to say, I think the Bill of Rights Committee may have been the most contentious group in the convention. I think it was, you had Elmer Gertz, but you also had Father Lawler, who was quite a conservative person.
Yes.
You had Al Raby on that committee. So
Yes.
you had a number of people who had very, very strong feelings about it. And one of the things that we, I'm sure, all regret to this day, for example, is there's one typo in the Illinois Constitution in the Bill of Rights, which is a word that's misspelled, because after all of the things came out of the Bill of Rights Committee, there was an agreement that no one was allowed to change a single word, even the typo, because there had been such an enormous amount of tension around crafting language that was acceptable to the committees.
Is that where that third comma
No,
came
the third
in?
comma's in the judicial article. No,
Oh,
this is the
okay.
word by instead of be. But I think...
But can you summarize, how did, if Elmer were here today, would he say, well, we failed at the Constitutional Convention?
No,
We
no.
succeeded.
He did
What would
very
he
well.
say?
He did very well. He did very well. As an example, the Illinois Constitution provides that there cannot be discrimination based on gender. So Illinois never ratified the Equal Rights Amendment, but the Illinois Constitution contains a similar provision.
I think the committee did an excellent job, John, and at one point we talked about the fact if we needed more money, we could charge admission to the committee hearings.
Let's just go down some of the major areas. So you would give, but I appreciate your swimming in these seas and tackling
You did great.
this subject. Thank you very much, and Father Lawler aside, amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.